Holy God. Excuse me. Thank you. No, it's okay. I'm sure it wasn't intentional. What a pleasure it is to be here tonight. Thank you. And how nice of the Strand to host this evening. The Strand it's like our Mecca, isn't it? When people tell you they're coming to New York, don't you say, well, of course you're going to the Strand, right? You're going to Mecca. But enough from me. The first time I heard Ayelet Waldman's name was in 2003. My friend Amanda Davis had recently moved from San Francisco to Brooklyn, from Brooklyn for a teaching job. She wrote me that she was a little lonely at first, but she was quickly falling in love with her new life. In large part, I could tell because she had made a new friend, a fellow writer. When we talked on the phone, she said her name, Ayelet Waldman. Ayelet? I said. Ayelet, she said. How do you pronounce it again? She broke it down for me. I yell it. Ayelet, which if you know how fierce and smart and passionate Ayelet is, her name suits her to a T. She's a dogged and vocal political activist for liberal causes. She has made a name for herself as a nonfiction writer by going where few of us have ever dared to go before, authoring frankly provocative personal essays on marriage and parenting and drugs and sex, all the hits. Her memoir, Bad Mother, stirred controversy, discomfiting the smug "My kid is an honors student" bumper sticker set, and gave comfort to those of us who might be lusting for a glass of wine with our Pop-Tarts. Which, for a long time, I thought meant that I was like one of the Manson moms. So it was really nice to meet Ayelet for that reason, too. Her book, of course, was a New York Times bestseller. How could it not be? Millions of mothers the world over, thank you. Ayelet made her name as a fiction writer with a series of darkly witty mommy-track mystery novels, followed soon by the novels Daughter's Keeper, Red Hook Road, and Love and Other Impossible Pursuits. 3 emotionally resonant novels that explore the complexities of love, the absurdity of contemporary life, the wages of grief, and the resilience of the human heart. And now, of course, we have Love and Treasure. Love and Treasure is a wildly imaginative, ambitious, morally complex, expertly constructed novel following the lives of American and Hungarian Jews across the 20th century. Running through the center of the novel is the Hungarian Gold Train. Intercepted in 1945 by American forces outside of Salzburg, the train is heaped with a priceless trove of riches, art, candlesticks, jewelry, all seized from the Hungarian Jews by the Nazis. Love and Treasure is about art and loss. It's about family identity, female power, and the multitude of ways that history binds us together. In 2003, our friend Amanda, while touring the country to promote her new novel, Wonder When You'll Miss Me, was killed in a plane crash. Ayelet wrote me, "So I feel like I know you. And I'm figuring we're pretty much doing the same thing, which is talking to friends, making jokes, and breaking down crying every couple of hours. I have a copy of Amanda's book for you, signed. I bought 15 of them for all of us." This is Ayelet, extending herself generously, reaching out to a stranger, speaking honestly about our shared experience. There were times when I could make jokes, what was wrong with me, and times when I was made useless by grief, what was wrong with me, and she was feeling the same way, which seems like her calling, taking our shared painful history and putting it into words, and quite often making us laugh, too. I have no idea what she's going to read this evening, but I really do feel very, very proud to be here introducing her, and please give her a warm, warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Elissa. If you have not read Elissa's work, you must. It is just so, her sentences are gorgeous, her sense of humor is amazing, her incisive, eviscerating wit is exactly what we need. And if you don't leave with a copy of my book, I demand that you leave with a copy of hers. And our daughters played together in a punk band at Wesleyan called Faceplant. And they recently appeared, I think, were they headlining at Panty Punk, which was exactly what you'd imagine. We're so proud. Just like Amy Chua's daughters, I'm sure. All right, so I am not going to read tonight, actually, and I'm not going to read for a reason. There are a lot of writers in this room, and we all go to a lot of readings, and we all know that sometimes those readings can get really, really long, and sometimes the writers will talk in that voice, the one, where everything is very lovely and poetic, and it just kills me, and I've decided my daughter, Rosie, who is 12, does these PowerPoints about things like puppies and girl power. And I thought, if Rosie can do a puppy girl power PowerPoint, surely I can do a presentation that's something a little different than the norm. So that's what I'm going to try to do, because this novel is a historical novel, and we can learn a little something about the history. Someone who I love and trust, give me the fisheye if it's getting boring, and I'll wrap it up real quick. But so the title of this little talk of mine is called Finding the Gold Train, the Itinerary of an Idea. And the reason for that, it starts with that question that we all hate, the one question that every single one of us writers despises, the one that makes us squirm. Recite it with me in unison. Where do you get your ideas? When we're asked that, we all mumble something about like inspiration, experience, imagination. But this gentleman right here gave the best answer ever, him being Stephen King. Utica. When asked where he gets his ideas, he said Utica. And so why do we answer these? Why does he answer Utica? Why are we so often saying something so ridiculous? That's a little better. The glow of my computer will, you can see me by the glow of my computer. The reason that we answer something so absurd is because the source of an idea is so often so embarrassingly silly. So today, obviously, I'm going to talk about the source of the idea for Love and Treasure, the magical source of inspiration, which was not Utica, but Google. Yes, in fact, I Googled 3 words. Those words, Holocaust, Hungary, and art. And the story of why those 3 words ended up in the same search field is the story of today's discussion. When I was a little girl, we're going to go with Holocaust first, just to be clear. When I was a little girl, I was a compulsive reader. Do any of you recognize these from the 1970s? That is, in fact, a 1970s scholastic book order. When most kids were ordering their Nancy Drews and their Judy Blooms, I ordered some Judy Blooms, but I also ordered a lot. Oftentimes, my scholastic book order would look like a little trip through, Treblinka. I would order dozens of books about kids who survived the ghettos, kids who survived the camps, kids who, as far afield was as Summer of My German Soldier, women in their 40s, raise your hand. I know you all read that one. I would curl up behind this white rocking chair in my parents' living room, and I would read these books, and I would just sob and work myself into a kind of fantasy about being one of these children of the Holocaust. Sometimes I was the hero who survived. Sometimes I was the hero who sacrificed herself for her family or her very, very handsome boyfriend. And I started thinking as I was presenting, as I was actually even coming up with the idea for this talk, why was I so obsessed with the Holocaust? I was a very normal Jap from northern New Jersey, to be perfect. There's the red Aspen station wagon. I include that picture just because I can't quite believe I ever dressed in a tank top like that, but notice that station wagon that I almost never got to drive. Thanks, Mom. Anyway, why is it that like so many adolescents, Jewish adolescents in particular, but not just Jewish adolescents, are so obsessed with the Holocaust? And I think it has something to do with the fact that at that age, we're desperately trying to figure out who we are. And the idea that at some point in time, somebody wanted to kill us for who we are weighs really heavily on us. And it activates both our sense of fear and our sense of imagination. Obviously, independent of the Holocaust, kids like dark, violent stories of pain and suffering. And honestly, when you think about it, what's Escape from Warsaw when you compare it to some of the things they watch on television or in the movies? For me, this obsession with the Holocaust faded after adolescence, but then I had a baby. And I experienced something called postpartum obsessive compulsive disorder, which I wish meant I cleaned up a lot after my kid. Actually, my husband wishes it meant I cleaned up a lot. It did not mean that. It was this incredibly terrifying syndrome where women with postpartum OCD experience very vivid, very intense images, and they're almost across the board, people have the same images. So they're violent images of stabbing your baby or drowning your baby during a bath time. And you know, I had Sophie's 19 now. When I was going through this, there was no Google. So I couldn't just Google horrible images of stabbing your baby and be comforted by the fact that there's a syndrome and that you can take some SSRIs and be done with it. I instead became incredibly terrified. Women with postpartum OCD, just so that you can stop worrying about my children, never ever hurt their children, but they have an astronomical suicide rate for obvious reasons. My postpartum OCD was complicated by terrifying Holocaust fantasies. Unlike the ones when I was an adolescent, they had nothing to do with me being a child during the Holocaust, but rather me having a child. So, you know, I can't tell you how many hours I lay in bed nursing the baby and thinking, how do you change a diaper in a cattle car? As if that would be what you would be worried about. Of all the various things, that was my obsession. So as many of you know, when you are a writer and something nags at you and it consumes you and it eats you up, you end up writing about it. And it's something that I've always done. So for example, many years ago, I ended a pregnancy due to a bad genetic diagnosis. It was terribly traumatic, and I wrote about the experience for a very long time. The first book I wrote was about a mother who has to leave her baby and go to jail. And then I wrote a ghost story about a woman haunted through her baby monitor by the ghost of her stillborn baby. I know, just like insanely creepy. And finally, I wrote a novel about a woman whose baby dies of SIDS, which was sort of the clearest way that I could get to writing about that experience. And in the same way that experience nagged at me, the Holocaust nagged at me. I wanted to write about it. But there is a huge problem in writing about the Holocaust. I call it the Life is Beautiful problem. You may love that movie. I do not. It is incredibly challenging to write about the Holocaust without being exploitative. At the worst end of the spectrum, you get kind of a feel-good fable about a death camp, right? That movie stands for everything I didn't want to do. It feels utterly inauthentic to me. But then I found something out. Roberto Benigni's father survived Bergen-Belsen. So suddenly, everything becomes very complicated because even the authenticity of lived experience does not guarantee any kind of artistic authenticity. It can be very, very discouraging, and you add to the fact that, you know, bleakness is not a selling point in fiction necessarily, so you have this compulsion to make it life-affirming so that there's at least one book club that'll read it. So you end up with books that feature, and now I'm just going to do this thing where I show you books that drive me crazy. You end up with books that feature like The Good Nazi, right? Or you end up with books that have a kind of Holocaust magic realism. This is a phenomenal book, people. But it began this horrible strain in contemporary, particular Jewish American writing of the magic realist Holocaust novel, which we need to stop right now. Nobody has to do that anymore. You know, it's a very short step from using the golem to illustrate the powerlessness of the Jews to, say, using the golem and the death of the Jews to illustrate, you can't really see that, but it says, today's menu, tourist menu, golem's anger, chicken satay with rice. Right? Exploitation lurks around every corner. You know, you get books that use the Holocaust the way we sometimes see the use of a dead child in a book as a trick for easy emotion. And the problem is, and I'm not trying to trash you, maybe you love this book, the problem is that this can lead to the most offensive and crass kind of Holocaust kitsch. So for example, you like the book Sarah's Key? Well, now you can have Sarah's style. You too can accessorize like a deportee at the velodrome. This is an actual ad. So Obviously, there are works that illuminate without exploiting. And to me, the quintessential example of this is W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz. This is a book about the Holocaust. The white space in this book is about the Holocaust. But there is not a single scene in a camp. There is not a single scene even in Europe during the Holocaust. Most of the scenes during that time take place in England. But it is a book that is permeated by the Holocaust. Now, I am no Sebald. God knows, and I could never be. But, when I set out trying to write this novel, I thought I would much rather try to be Sebald than try to write Sarah's Key. So, in a very early draft of the novel, I actually wrote 2 scenes set in Dachau based on descriptions of incidents recounted by members of the Rainbow Division. This was the U.S. Army division that liberated Dachau. This is some of my best writing, man. So full of details. This is the only terrible picture you're going to see. One of them describes a scene of a train outside of Dachau. This is when the Americans pulled up in front of Dachau to liberate it. They found this train full of bodies. Every car, when they opened it, looked like that. The thing was, there was no smell, which meant that the people on that train were so newly dead that the bodies had not yet begun to decompose. I wrote a scene about this and about one photograph in particular, a photograph of the single survivor of the train found by the American liberators. So here is this photograph. I mean, again, this scene is the best writing I've ever done, but look at this picture. This is an incredibly compelling photograph, but it's a composed photograph. There was a moment in the taking of this photograph where the lens was focused, where the men stopped, where the photographer climbed up after these two, one is a colonel and one is a tank commander, where he climbed up into the car and he told them to wait a second for him to shoot. And it was that moment that I wanted to write about. And frankly, I think I did so beautifully. And then I cut it and threw it out, because I couldn't do it without being exploitative. This scene, I mean, everything that you cut out is so much more beautiful than what you leave in, right? Because no one ever has to critique it. But in my imagination, there was no way I could ever set a scene in this book in the camp during the Holocaust without falling prey to that life is beautiful problem. So what was I going to do, right? I wanted to write about this subject. It was eating away at me, but I had to find an approach that did not lend itself to, a fashion spread of Sarah's style. So that leads me to my second search term, which is art. So why art? There's famous advice to writers that we have all heard. Mark Twain said it, write what you know. Or Faulkner, no one knows who said it. Half the people think it's Twain, half the people think it's Faulkner. Maybe it was just like some lady in an MFA program sick of reading science fiction stories. It's really, really, really good advice, right? It gives you authenticity. It allows you to describe things you've seen so you can do them with more juice. But, and at first I took this advice. I first started writing after I quit my job as a federal public defender. And I wrote a series of murder mysteries about a former federal public defender turned stay-at-home mom who solves murders to keep from dying of boredom. And then I wrote a novel about the drug war and mandatory minimums. And you heard I wrote a novel about the loss of a baby. Write what you know is really, 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 really good advice. But writers lead boring lives. Really boring lives. So unless you're going to do what these guys did and blow your life up in order to give you something to write about, you are going to write some really, really boring stories. And I cannot blow my life up because look at that. Rosie taught me how to do that. Because I have these children. So I can't destroy my life to give it a top. And frankly, I'm Kinahora, knock on wood, really happy. And happy is not so interesting in fiction. So I changed my rule. With all due respect to Faulkner and Mark Twain or whatever MFA professor who actually made up that rule, I try to write not necessarily what I know, but what I want to know, what I can imagine. So for example, in Red Hook Road, I wrote about 3 things I knew nothing about but wanted desperately to learn. I wrote about classical music. I started, just to let you know how little I knew about classical music, I once said to Michael, "Oh, that's so pretty. What is it? What are you playing on the CD?" And he said, Honey, that's Beethoven. So, like, I started with The Idiot's Guide to Classical Music. I'm not kidding you. That was the book that I began my research. And then I moved on to audio lectures and memoirs of musicians, and now I can actually recognize Beethoven. I also wanted to learn about boat building, wooden boat building, because we live in the summer in Brooklyn, Maine. I also wanted to learn about boxing, because I am oddly fascinated by large, well-built men beating each other up. And now, if I were only 22, I can do color commentary on a boxing match. I am not quite Joyce Carol Oates, but it would definitely get me a date if I didn't have a lovely pacifist husband at home. The funny thing, of course, is that Red Hook Road is a novel about marriage and boxing and boat building, and classical music are all metaphors for marriage in the novel. Art was one of those topics I knew nothing about but always wished I did. I was one of those people who would stare at a Jackson Pollock painting and say, oh, my kid can do that. That's a really embarrassing thing to be, especially if you have friends who are really successful and well-known artists. I needed to correct my desperate lack of education. So I decided to write a novel that would force me to learn something about visual art. And which leads us to our search term, which is the most random and ridiculous of them all. Why Hungary? No, I have no Hungarian relatives. My relatives are from Kiev, Minsk, and, I'm forgetting Odessa, which all are, none of them are Russia, although I guess Odessa is Russia now as of like last month. But when you asked, they would tell you they were from Russia. Hungary, my friend Eleni was appointed ambassador to Hungary, and I really wanted to visit her and deduct the travel expenses from my taxes. So here you have it, the glorious inspiration of tax avoidance and ignorance and a strange Holocaust obsession, which led me to this incredible story of the Hungarian Gold Train, one I had heard nothing about. So before I tell you what the Hungarian Gold Train is, I'm going to tell you a very little bit about what it was like to be a Jew in pre-Holocaust Hungary. If you were a Jew in pre-Holocaust Hungary, you probably lived in Budapest, a city that was about 25% Jewish, so Jewish that this man, Karl Lueger, the notoriously anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna, called it Judapest. Rosie also showed me how to do the thing with the bubbles. The Jews of Budapest worshipped in these fantastic synagogues. The Dohányi Street Synagogue, for example, is the most opulent and beautiful and large in Europe. You might have been a doctor or a lawyer. Almost half of the doctors and lawyers of Budapest were Jewish. Your money definitely would have been invested by Jews. 91% of the currency brokers were Jewish. There were poor Jews in Budapest, but many were middle class and upper class. You know, the women went to synagogue sisterhoods, and they were feminists. Rosa Schwimmer was one of the leading suffragists of her day. And as soon as I read about her, I knew that I had to make her an important part of my novel. I mean, we had dignitaries and Nobel Prize winners and leading intellectuals and scientists and famous artists like Robert Capa. Doesn't it sound like a city you all know and love? Doesn't it sound a lot like New York? Except for one important difference. Athletes. Over half of the Olympic gold medal winners of Hungary were Jews. Dudes, Jews, Jewish, dominant Jew. Are you not astonished? I mean, not just Mark Spitz. There were fencers. This is Alona Ellick who won the gold. I mean, they wiped the floor with the Olympics. They were incredible. I mean, obviously, it was not all roses and sunshine. In the wake of World War I, the Jews of Hungary began to experience sort of hints of what was to come, but still, by and large, the Jewish community of Hungary was successful, secure, and content up until World War II. Now, quick history lesson, Hungary was an ally of Germany during the war, but ironically, that protected the Jews of Hungary. For many years of the war, Hungary didn't put the Jews in ghettos, it didn't deport them to Poland. I mean, it's true that their situation got more precarious, and there were anti-Jewish laws that threw them out of their professions, but the fact was that, some Jews had to join labor brigades, a fair number of them lost their lives, but there were no ghettos, there were no deportations, there were no camps. By and large, they were protected protected from the fate of the rest of Europe, of the Jews of the rest of Europe, up until 1944. In 1944, in the spring, Hitler invaded Hungary, and then everything went to hell. Among the first things that happened was the Hungarian Arrow Cross. That's their fascist, look, we too can have a swastika. The fascist government of Hungary forced the Jews of Hungary to hand over all their valuables. So they would stand in line. This is a photograph of Jews waiting in line to hand in their radios to the authorities. They would get these edicts day by day. Today you must hand in your radios. Today you must hand in your bicycles. Today you must hand in your gold. Day after day, until eventually all their property was turned in. Everything from jewelry to candlesticks to bicycles to telephones, whatever you can imagine. This here is a propaganda photo meant to illustrate the stupendous wealth of the Jews. At the same time, Eichmann and a very small group of SS, 20 officers and a staff of 100, arrived in Budapest. Eichmann said, "I have lost the war against the Allies, but there's one war I can win, and that is the war against the Jews." So the Russians are advancing from the east. Eichmann renovates the ovens at Auschwitz to increase their capacity and then deports nearly 500,000 Jews from the Hungarian countryside in less than 2 months. Virtually the entire population of the Jewish population of the Hungarian countryside. Budapest Jews went through their own torment. There were disease, there was starvation, there were massacres, you had about a 50% chance of survival if you were a Jew living in Budapest. You had a 10% chance of survival if you were a Jew living in the countryside. The Jews of Budapest who did survive, many of them survived because of the courage of foreign governments like Raoul Wallenberg's Swedish embassy who protected Jews. Meanwhile, all back to the train. All of this property is being gathered, it's being sorted. A lot of it is being stolen, but what remains goes to becomes the property, sort of the purview of the Jewish Property Office. This is a bureaucratic agency that's designed to deal with the property. So again, Russia invading from the east, closing in on Budapest, and Arpad Toldi, who's the head of the Jewish Property Office, concocts this plan to get the Jewish loot out of Hungary. He loads it onto a freight train and sends it off in the direction of Berlin. So what was on the train? Anything you can imagine of value. Anything from diamonds and pearls to paintings and stamp collections. The estimates of the value of the train vary wildly from, if you're talking in today's currency, somewhere between $500 million to $4 billion. Toldi, this Hungarian fascist, skimmed a lot of the most valuable stuff from the train, like the most valuable gems. Most of what he took, he hid in the Austrian countryside, and most of it wasn't found. What was found because these Austrian peasants discovered the loot, and these milkmaids basically started showing up at market wearing diamond diadems in their hair and ropes of pearls, milking their cows while in a mink stole. And shockingly, the French, who were then in control of that area, thought, oh, maybe that's not their stuff, and took a bunch of it. The French, who found some of Toldi's loot, Toldi took most of it, probably died somewhere in the French Foreign Legion. His family kept the money. There was no justice served there. Don't expect any. The French did turn what they found back over to the Hungarian government, but by then the Hungarian government was a Soviet government, and they just kept it, saying, meh, maybe it's Jewish, maybe it's not, who knows, we'll just keep it. Okay, so back to our train. So we've got this trainload of property. We have these Hungarian guards freaking out. The war is over, and they are in possession of the accumulated wealth of a murdered people. Not going to go well for them, right? So what do? They turn it over to the Americans. They find an American military unit. They basically say, hi, this is for you, and we're out of here. And in 1945, the Americans move all this loot to Salzburg, which is, if you can believe it, where the drama really starts and where my book starts. Because what are the Americans going to do with all this wealth of all these dead Jews? At this point, we have about 850,000 Jewish survivors of the camps and of Europe living in DP camps, displaced persons camps. There are other people in the DP camps, but there's a core of 850,000 Jews and the other people who are in the DP camps, they can go home. But when the Jews try to go home, they end up getting killed. So the Jews are stuck there in Austria and Germany in the DP camps, and that it's a tremendous drain on U.S. resources because the U.S. government is paying to educate them, to feed them, and these are traumatized people with tens of thousands of orphans with no parents. It's tremendously expensive. And there begins to be pressure by the refugee aid organizations on the U.S. government to give them the assets from the gold train. Give it to us, we'll use it to pay for these people, then you don't have to pay for it. Meanwhile, don't forget, half of the Jews of Budapest still survived. And when they went and turned in their radios, for example, at the post office, they got receipts. So they're in Budapest and they're saying, no, that's our stuff, that's my mother's candlesticks, and I have a receipt to prove it. But don't forget what happened when the French returned the stuff to Hungary. The Soviets just took it all. And by now, we are well into the Cold War, and the Russians are our real enemies. So on the one hand, you've got the refugee aid organization saying, well, give it to us, we'll use it to feed these Jews. You don't want to feed them. You've got the Hungarian Jews saying, give me my stuff back. And then there's a third group that comes forward. It's a group called Mossad La'aliyah Bet. Don't let that word Mossad confuse you. It's not, in fact, the Israeli intelligence. At this point in time, Palestine is governed by the British under British mandate. And this young group of Jews, this group of young Jews from Palestine comes forward and they start asking for the money. Why do they want it? Well, again, those 850,000 Jewish DPs living in the camps, they all desperately want to go to Palestine. So much so, in fact, that when the International Refugee Organizations gave out a survey to the DP saying, where do you want to go? And they had a number 1 and number 2. And the vast majority of Jews chose Palestine, and that's it. They only filled a number 1. The Refugee Aid Organization said you have to have a second choice, and they reissued the survey, and a substantial majority of the Jews wrote in the number 2 slot on their survey, crematoria. So they were desperate to get to Palestine. So what happens is these young Jews from what is soon to become Israel comes into Austria, and they start helping the Jews from the DP camps escape over the Alps from Austria into Italy, where they then load them on ships. Remember Exodus? Back from, when we were kids? They load them on ships to run the blockades, the British blockades of Palestine, to either get them to Palestine, which is a great option, or get them fired on by the British, because the only thing better than having the Jews, the surviving Jews, land in Palestine is to have the international media shoot photographs of children who have survived the death camps being fired on by the British Army. Okay, so the Jewish Agency is secretly saying to the U.S. government, give us that money, give it to us, and then we'll get all these Jews out of your hair onto some boats. Then it's the British problem. You never have to see them again. So everybody's vying for this cash, and meanwhile it's sitting in a warehouse, very well guarded, right? Everything is fine. No, not so much. At the same time that this is going on, high-ranking U.S. Army officers who are now stationed in Europe to oversee post-war and Marshall Plan reconstruction, they're being billeted in houses taken from Austrian wealthy, sometimes nobility, sometimes bourgeois. But when the Austrian noblemen, and don't let those Austrians tell you that they're the first victims of the Nazis. They were like parades in the goddamn streets. Nobody has ever been as happy to see Hitler as an Austrian. So before they turn over their houses to the American government, they strip the houses bare of furnishings. So the American generals, and some of these guys are like authentic heroes. This is Harry Collins. He liberated Dachau. He might have been a publicity hound, but he was a real American hero of the war. He gets this house. There's nothing in it. There's no dishes. There's no silverware. There are no glasses. There's nothing. And like across town, there's this warehouse full of dishes and glassware and towels and linens. So what do? They start requisitioning. They requisition the dishes and the towels and the linens and the carpets and everything from the gold train. And if they use it to furnish their homes in Austria, and then eventually they finish their tour of duty and they go back to wherever they're from, to Nebraska or Iowa or wherever, and they pack it up and they take it with them. And that is at that moment that we realize that even the most heroic among us is not immune to acts of, let's say, ambiguous morality. Eventually, there was an auction in New York City in 1948. The decision was made that the International Refugee Organization would get the proceeds of the gold train. Remember what I told you? Somewhere between $500 million and $4 billion. The sum total of the proceeds of the auction, $152,850.61. It's about $1.5 million in today's money. Gone. It was gone. It was stolen. It moldered away. It disappeared. It vanished. I knew when I read that story that that's what my novel was going to be about, because I had this pair of candlesticks that I inherited from my Bubba, my great-grandmother. They're like this big. The story is she shoved them under her skirt and walked out of Minsk with them. I don't know. You have to have a pretty voluminous skirt. But I love those candlesticks. As ugly as they are, I adore them. But they're silver plate. They're not silver. If Antiques Roadshow were to show up in my town, they'd probably be like, dime a dozen. Silver plate candlesticks from a Jewish Bubba? Forget it. But they are not to sound like a MasterCard ad, those candlesticks are worth more to me than almost anything I have except my husband and my children. And that made me start thinking, what is the weight? What is the value what is the value of those candlesticks? What is the value of a pair of those candlesticks when the great-grandmother was murdered and there was no great-granddaughter to care about them? Maybe the weight of the silver, and what about if there are 100,000 pair of candlesticks that nobody has any emotional attachment to at all? I knew that whatever story I told was going to be one that allowed me to explore this idea of the inherent value or valuelessness of property, the role of memory, of legacy, and then on the other hand, the enduring nature of art as opposed to the incredibly, tragically transient nature of life. A story about the Holocaust, but one that allowed me to strive to be more Zebaldian in approach. And that's the story of Love and Treasure. It traces a piece of property found on the Gold Train. It begins in 1945 in Salzburg. It's about a young American Army lieutenant named Jack Weissman, who is part of the occupying force of Salzburg, who is tasked with guarding the contents of the Gold Train. He falls in love with a young Hungarian Holocaust survivor of the camps named Ilona. And eventually he, like so many of his fellow military men, takes something from the Gold Train. He takes a pendant in the shape of a peacock. And then in the second section of the book, which takes place in present-day Budapest, Jack asks his granddaughter to find someone to whom to return this pendant, an heir of the owner. By some miracle, perhaps the owner herself. The final section of the novel traces the pendant back to its original owner, a young suffragist in Budapest in 1913, before World War I, during the golden age of the Hungarian Jewish community that I talked to you about, and is about her relationship with her psychoanalyst, who is a disciple of Sandor Ferenczi, who you can see here with Sigmund Freud. It's about this young woman's intellectual and emotional and feminist awakening at the International Conference of Women's Suffrage in Budapest, which took place in 1913. And that's the novel. And I don't know if this is going to work, but theoretically, we should be able to play that in the background while I take questions from people. If that happens, and that's just some images and, we can get some lights up. Yeah? Done. So what do you think? Better than a reading? Worse than a reading? All right. It's this compulsive desire to teach people something, since I no longer am a professor. But I would love to take comments and questions. I know my mother will start it off if you all are too cowardly to do so. Anybody? Ah, there's someone.
I'm going to bring a microphone over as well so everybody can hear.
That's an incredibly complex history that was mostly hidden. So could you talk, I assume, so you had to uncover so much of that. Can you talk about your research?
Sure, I would be happy to. I went to, I got my tax deduction. I went to Budapest and I went to Budapest. And I went to Salzburg and I went to Dachau. I did a tremendous amount of research while I was there. And then what really happened was I had two research assistants, one in Budapest and one in Salzburg. And the research assistant in Budapest was phenomenal. She was a young woman who was getting her PhD in women's studies. And she was like it was like the story of the cobbler and the elves because of the time difference. So I would be working and I would realize, what I really need to know is what would have been in a shop window in 1936 in the largest department store in a small city in the Transylvanian countryside. And I would send an email. And when I woke up, there would be a photograph from 1936 of a shop window, and there would be a little translation. I mean, it was amazing. And very quickly she figured out what I wanted, which was not sort of the essays about the status of women. I mean, I liked those. Those were interesting. She translated some of them. But I really wanted, the advertisements from the newspapers and the letters to the editor and the little bits and pieces that really give you a flavor of the time and the place. My German research assistant was also very, very competent. I took to calling her Madchen, however, because I felt like she had certain qualities that would have made her a very, very effective, youth group leader during the middle of the last century. She would often greet me in the morning with the words Achtung, Ayelet, which just means attention, but is actually terrifying if you are a Jew that grew up on stories of the Holocaust. And she did not care for the direction of my research. She felt she had a much clearer idea of where things should be going than I did. And it is only because I have a daughter who's even bossier than I am, who was with me in Salzburg, and at some point my daughter turned to me and said, "You don't have to do what she says." And that's why I got the stuff that I needed about the DP camps. But it was about doing, and research is the fun part. Anybody who's ever written, there are a bunch of people that I'm looking at who've written historical fiction in this room, and I know research is the seductive part. You could research forever. You could read those old newspapers and look at those piles of photographs and never ever have to sit down in front of your computer and actually put the words down on paper. So soon enough you have to forget all that and just write and hope you can fill it in. Yes.
Coming from Europe, I brought the British.
Oh, you did? Isn't it pretty?
There is this very nice dependent with a peacock.
Yes.
Yes, and so I would like to ask you, did you find this dependent, or?
No, I never found it. It's a fantasy completely, but I like the idea of a peacock because in Hungary, a peacock is a sign of bad luck. It's ill fortune. And I love the idea of my character wearing as almost a kind of, how do you say afsaluchis in English? Anybody? Any Yiddish speakers? In spite of. Just almost to spite her fate to wear a pendant with a peacock that that she was spitting fortune in the eye. I looked long and hard for one when I was in Budapest, but I never found one because it's like, who wants a peacock? It's like bad luck. Only me. Anybody else? Yes?
How do you know as a writer if you're being exploited?
Well, I am free to say that there are writers who don't know, but I know. I had to trust my gut. I couldn't step foot into a camp in this novel because I would have been. Maybe it was because I didn't have the authenticity of lived experience. maybe it was for that reason, and maybe also it was because I didn't have this, for whatever reason, I knew that I had to set this book before and after and never during to try to prevent myself from crossing that boundary. But, I don't know that I did. I mean, in the way, isn't everything we do as writers, aren't we exploiting something? Aren't we just harvesting our own stories and other people's stories and torturing them into some version that's the best story we can tell? I mean, it can be a cruel business. I mean, ask my mom. Right, Mom? I mean, you do that. It's a dangerous thing to love someone who's a writer. It's a dangerous thing to find yourself in the path. And from the most personal to the larger, it's you just have to sort of figure out where your own lines are drawn. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career crossing lines that I don't know if I should have crossed. I mean, for example, I don't really write about my kids anymore. I used to, but I don't. Not because my kids said anything, but because at some point I realized that they are entitled to tell their own stories. I'm sure Sophie is crafting her memoir right now. It's called She Really Was a Bad Mother. And there are other rules that I don't break. I don't say anything bad about my husband in print, mostly because he's so perfect that there would be nothing bad to say, but also I don't do that. So, I mean, you have to, and I couldn't, write about Dacha, so whatever, everyone has their own sort of, you have to trust your gut. And you have to trust your readers. You find this group I was very lucky to marry my best reader, but you find readers who will tell you the truth. I mean, it is the most important thing in the world to have, as a writer, to have readers who will not lie to you, who will not, who either aren't so competitive that they will trash you because what they're really trashing is their sense of their own, how they feel about themselves in comparison to you, and also who won't tell you that things are good when they're not. I mean, you need the kind of brutal honesty. If it's really hard for you to do that for someone else or them to do that for you just have to do what Michael and I call the praise sandwich. Say something nice, eviscerate, close with something nice. Should we take one more question? Yes.
Hi. Have you and Michael ever talked about or thought about writing a novel together the way Marcia Muller and her husband have done?
With apologies to the many stupendous writers in the room, my husband is the best writer in the English language. I would never, ever let him sully his prose with my own. I actually say that as a joke, but I actually feel that way. And you are entitled to think someone else is the best writer in the English language. You can be wrong. I'm not saying everybody has to be right like me. We have written things together and had a really good time. We wrote what is the best pilot HBO ever rejected. It's phenomenal. They were fools. They will regret it they don't regret it. I regret it. But we did that together and we had a really, really good time. We're doing that again now. We worked on a musical for a bit together. I think it scares people when we work together who don't know us because there's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of, when we edit one another, we have never managed to skip the yelling part. So what invariably happens is, say, I give Michael my manuscript, and he says, well, you do this better. This is really, you got to fix this. This isn't working. And I say, you just have no idea what I'm trying to accomplish here. And if you had 1 ounce of intelligence, you would understand that what's really going on. And then I scream at him for a little while, and then eventually I say, oh my God, you're totally right. And I change it. And that has to happen every time, and it's same reversed. And I've often said to him, why don't you just skip the being mad at me part, because you're going to come around to seeing that I'm right. But yet we don't. We still have to do the yelling. But it's, it's great to be, we've been married a long time. We've been married over 20 years. And I think one of the things that keeps this, our marriage happy is that we have this creative relationship where we know we have something to talk about besides our children. I'm sure they appreciate that too. All right, well, I'm going to sign books. And I'm going to do this incredibly cool thing, which is my friend Andy Greer and I were once bitching and moaning about how Dave Eggers is such a great artist, and he draws this beautiful picture in everybody's book that he signs, and everybody gets their own picture that's special to them. And David Sedaris does it too, and there's no accident that they're selling millions of books with their gorgeous original art. But I can't draw for shit, and neither can Andy. So Andy gave me this beautiful stamp of a peacock. So I'm going to stamp your book. So you should totally buy a book. But actually, here's my pitch. You don't have to buy my book. I really want you to. My editor's here. Do me a favor. But you don't have to buy my book. But you have to buy a book. And here's why. We are in a situation where there is a voracious, terrifying corporation breathing down the necks of the independent bookstores of this country. And God bless New York is suddenly has some new independent bookstores. But this bookstore exists because we buy books in it. It doesn't exist because we all bring them our books and they don't want to buy them from us. It exists because we buy books from them. So buy a book, even if it's like a $2 paperback. Just keep them in business so that we can continue to have it as a personal, professional, literary, cultural resource. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Ayelet.